Welcome to this explainer. We are jumping right in today because we're breaking down exactly how India is navigating the incredibly high-stakes geopolitical chessboard of the Israel-Iran conflict. West Asia is transforming rapidly, right before our eyes, so we're going to look at the data, the diplomacy, and the underlying theories to understand how a rising power protects its vital interests when its partners are, quite literally, at war. So let's start with the big central question. How in the world do you navigate a war zone without taking sides? It's a massive balancing act. On one hand, you've got these deep structural economic and security ties with Israel and the Gulf states. But on the other, you have historical connections and absolutely crucial logistical pathways with Iran. For India, picking a side isn't just bad diplomacy, it's honestly an economic and strategic impossibility.
To make sense of this three-dimensional chess match, here is our roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover the West Asia crisis, look at India's high stakes, break down the new power triangle, discuss balancing ties with Iran, define India's strategic autonomy, and wrap up with the global South impact. Let's get to it.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the West Asia crisis.
Let's actually trace the timeline that brought the region to this boiling point. Since the conflict really intensified back in late February of 2026, the whole area has been on edge. But notice the major pivot that happened on June 17th. We saw a vital US-Iran ceasefire agreement come together, and that was largely mediated by Gulf nations like Qatar and Oman. So what was India doing during this incredibly turbulent window? Well, they deployed their top diplomat. Between July 5th and 10th, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar went on an absolute flurry of shuttle diplomacy. He undertook a crucial four-nation Gulf tour, hitting key players like the UAE and Bahrain, all to secure India's position while that ceasefire was holding.
Moving right along to Section 2, India's high stakes.
You might be wondering, why is India so relentlessly engaged in such a volatile region? Well, it's not just geopolitical posturing. It is literally about survival. Just think about this. A staggering 60% of India's energy imports come directly from West Asia. We're talking about the vital LPG supplies that power millions of everyday Indian homes and the crude oil that keeps the entire economy churning. When Minister Jaishankar visited the UAE, his absolute #1 priority was making sure these energy and logistics corridors stayed open, no matter what was happening with the conflict. For New Delhi, insulating the Indian consumer from a massive global energy shock is the overriding goal.
But honestly, beyond the oil, the human stakes here are just staggering. 10 million. That is 1 crore people. That's the number of Indian citizens currently living and working across the Gulf region. And they aren't just sending back crucial financial remittances, they are woven deeply into the social fabric of the Gulf. So trying to safeguard a diaspora of that size during missile strikes and regional instability, it's a monumental task. And tragically, the human cost is already very real. During some of the recent escalations involving merchant shipping, India actually lost 2 mariners. So the safety of those 10 million people completely dictates New Delhi's very cautious, measured approach.
And of course, we have to talk about the economic anchor. $200 billion. That is the massive annual bilateral trade volume between India and the Gulf. Any prolonged, dragged-out conflict that shuts down maritime routes directly threatens that commerce, not to mention the massive investments that flow from the Gulf right into the Indian economy.
Which brings us to Section 3, the new power triangle.
Okay, this is where things get really fascinating. How does this all build into a totally new alliance network? If you look at the region pre-2020, relations between the UAE and Israel were basically entirely in the shadows. We're talking secretive back-channel meetings and virtually non-existent trade. But the 2020 Abraham Accords, they completely flipped the script in the Middle East. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing things that were frankly unimaginable just a few years ago. We've got overt Israeli military deployment on UAE soil, including advanced drone detection systems, to protect against mutual threats. Meanwhile, trade between the two completely exploded, hitting over $3 billion by 2024.
So, where does India slot into this giant puzzle? Smack in the middle. India is practically the cornerstone of this new triangle. On one side, India shares a massive $85 billion trade partnership with the UAE, making India their second largest trading partner. On the other side, India has quietly but steadily built one of the absolute strongest strategic partnerships in the world with Israel, relying heavily on them for cutting-edge defense tech like drones and missile systems. And to bring it all full circle, Israel is now selling its Spider and Iron Dome systems to the UAE. It is a deeply, deeply interconnected web of economic and military reliance.
Let's pivot a bit to Section 4, balancing ties with Iran.
You know, true diplomacy is really all about exceptional balance. So while India was intensely engaging those Gulf nations to secure energy and trade, like we saw with Minister Jaishankar's visits, they also impartially accommodated Iran's requests. Right when the conflict was peaking around late February and early March, India actually allowed 3 Iranian naval ships, including the frigate IRS Dina, to dock in Indian ports. India's leadership framed this as a humane gesture, and the Iranian foreign minister even openly thanked them for it. It just goes to show that India is keeping an open line of communication with Tehran. They are proving they won't just slam the door on one partner to keep another partner happy.
So, what do we call this approach? That's Section 5, India's strategic autonomy.
If you're a geopolitics nerd, you will love this term, strategic autonomy. India's entire Look West policy is anchored in this concept. Basically, it means New Delhi isn't picking sides in the Israel-Iran conflict. They are independently picking their own national interests. It's the exact reason India can buy top-tier defense tech from Israel, secure millions of barrels of oil from the UAE, and provide port access to Iran, all at the exact same time. It's all based on issue-by-issue cooperation, rather than getting boxed in by rigid formal alliances.
We can also look at this through the lens of neoclassical realism. Fancy academic term, right? But what it essentially argues is that a country's foreign policy isn't just about grand global power struggles, it is deeply, heavily driven by domestic factors. For India, keeping the price of petrol affordable for everyday citizens and ensuring the safety of those 10 million diaspora workers, those are the primary domestic drivers dictating their pragmatic actions on the world stage. Its foreign policy completely dictated by domestic necessity. Finally, let's zoom out. Section 6, the Global South Impact. Because what happens in West Asia definitely doesn't stay in West Asia. For the broader Global South, the Israel-Iran conflict is a massive, looming economic storm. A lot of developing nations are incredibly dependent on imported energy, so when tensions flare up, global energy prices inevitably spike. And that leads directly to maritime supply chain disruptions, hugely increased logistical costs, and ultimately severe, crippling inflation for fragile economies. It literally threatens to derail economic growth and poverty reduction across Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
There's a quote from researchers that hits the nail right on the head here. Geopolitical instability in one region can have significant economic and strategic consequences for developing countries worldwide. And that is exactly why India is throwing its diplomatic weight around at the UN and through regional tours, constantly pushing for de-escalation, restraint, and multilateral cooperation. They are trying to position themselves as a responsible stakeholder, a leading voice for the Global South, aiming to protect developing nations from the devastating economic fallout of a war they frankly have no part in.
And that leaves us with one really fascinating question to wrap up this explainer. As the world becomes much more multipolar and these regional conflicts increasingly threaten global stability, developing nations are desperately looking for ways to survive without being forced into rigid Cold War-style alliances. We've seen exactly how India successfully balances its energy needs, its defense partnerships, and its diaspora safety through strict non-alignment and pragmatic engagement. So, as global competition just continues to heat up, could India's model of strategic autonomy actually become the ultimate blueprint for the entire Global South to navigate the conflicts of tomorrow? Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.